word initially? What worked in the story? What do you think that worked in the story? When I told the story, what really grabbed your attention? Anyone want to come in? Pitch? The variation in the pitch. Thank you. Anyone else?
Gestures, mighty king.
Mighty theme. Gestures, right?
Change your position. Rama came in.
Changing the position, right? Anything else, anyone? Yes, Srinidhi.
Giving a visual.
Giving
Right.
a visual.
Right.
So these are some things that you can carry on to your classroom. You may be already doing this, but these are something we are specifying in this workshop, so you could re-emphasize this in your classroom. You're seeing it happen, how it's being done when you listen to a story rather than you telling the story. You already, I'm pretty sure most of you are doing all the things that we're talking. But when we show it to you, it's getting re-emphasized in your head. You're keeping that in your mind, and it's getting hit again and again. Secondly, what would you use differently? What would you think you would use? What would you use in your classroom that I used here today? What do you think you can use? Any of the thing, maybe pitch. Do you think you would use a pitch? The variation? You have some sleepy students, you could capture their attention by just saying loudly and they'll be like, right? That captures them, that wakes them up, right? What do you do differently? What do you think can be done differently? Yes, Reem.
I would probably put a little bit more, obviously depending on the audience, I would probably put a little bit more emphasis. I took some notes down. When you use words like jump and mighty, a bit more energy into it, a bit more.
So you can grab the kids. Very good point. Thank you.
So say, instead of saying mighty, say mighty. Raise the pitch and the action.
Very good point.
Depending on your audience.
Toastmaster, that's right. So that's one thing you can do, right? When you tell a story, for us, I agree, we have a better attention span, but for kids, to grab them, a bigger emphasis on certain words, we just, wow, there is something important going on here, right? So those things, yes, please.
What I do, I don't have stories, but what I do is I make them part of my conversation.
Discussion.
So they become a subject.
Awesome.
So the ball is there and then they have to learn. So that's how I get their attention also. And
That's a great
how I get them to participate.
That's a great technique too. Have them talk to you, have a conversation, discussion, but keep them as a
But
subject.
it's not the story. That's all.
Yeah, I get that, but you can use some of the techniques that we're using there,
Yes.
right? In that too, because of course I can guarantee you're going to have some students who don't want to be part of the discussion. To get them in, some of these techniques are really
Right.
useful. Thank you for sharing. Now,
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Lata.
Just as a suggestion, what I find is many of the kids, what I do is I just give them an outline and then I make them enact the roles. Give them dialogues. If I tell a story, sometimes some kids listen, some kids don't.
Hands-on.
Yeah, so if they participate in the story, like acting out like a drama skit, then their interest level goes up. So they can have a kid as a king, kid as a Brahmo,
And then have them act out the story.
Yes.
Give them the story and act out. That's a very good point too.
So some kids like it.
Yeah.
They like to act out.
I agree. Thank you. Yes, please.
Just a question.
Sure.
At the end, when you set the moral of the story,
Uh-huh.
is it okay for the storyteller herself to say the moral, or is it better to ask the students? Because it was a very nice story. Until then, it was very suspenseful. And should they take on the suspense, breaking the suspense, or should the storyteller?
I think that's what do you think? To me, that's a storyteller perspective, I would think. So now, I like those questions. We'll have more discussion later. But right now, I'll hand it back to Paul, who's going to tell another story. He's an experienced Toastmaster, distinguished Toastmaster, past district governor, Paul White, who helped us start this Toastmaster club here. And he would touch on many more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How many of you have heard the story of Savitri and Satyabhama? Yes? Because it's a very old and popular story. So I'm going to tell that today, perhaps not as well as you can tell it, because one of the things I truly believe is that when you tell a story in the language that it was written in, it's so much more powerful than when you tell it in a foreign language, especially when you're telling it in English to a group who can understand the natural native language. There once, in the days of legend in India, was a very famous king. A king who had many, many, many wives, because that was the tradition in those days. He was so rich that he led a wonderful life of leisure. And he was a wonderful king. He was a great ruler. But he wasn't happy. Why wasn't he happy? He had all of those wives, but he didn't have any children. And that tore at his heart. So every morning, when the sun rose over a mighty river close to his palace, you would find him standing in front of the altar, the sacred fire, beseeching the sun god to bless him with children. And when that same sun set in the west over the distant mountains, you would find him again in front of the altar, the sacred fire, beseeching the sun god to bless him with children. The people in the palace were starting to worry. 18 years he had stood every morning and every evening praying to the sun god. They were worried about him. They thought it's impossible for him to have children, and he's still doing this. He persisted. And one early morning, when he was standing in front of the sacred flame, praying, there was a bright flash of light that caused him to step back. And when he rubbed his eyes and he looked, he saw a beautiful goddess coming out of the flame, floating into the air. And he said, "Who are you?" She said in beautiful tones, almost like music, "I'm Savitri, the daughter of the sun god. You have been so loyal, so dedicated, that we are going to bless you with a child." In less than a year, the king's favorite wife gave birth to a baby, a beautiful daughter. They named the baby Savitri in honor of the goddess. This baby was so beautiful, so radiant, that she seemed almost godlike. And as she grew older and older and older, her beauty intensified, her intelligence intensified, her radiance intensified. And that was wonderful. But everyone in the kingdom thought that she must be a goddess. So when it came time for her to get married, not one man stepped forward to ask for her hand. She became very sad as she thought about how impossible it was going to be for her to find a husband. So the king, who was also now very sad because when his daughter was sad, he also was sad, he called her to the throne room. And he said, "My beautiful daughter, perhaps if you go beyond the palace walls, out into the kingdom, you will find a man who's worthy of being your husband. And when you find that man, I will arrange a marriage." So you can imagine, there was a great procession from the palace with elephants, with servants, with counselors, as this beautiful princess went forward and out into the kingdom. The first day, the second day, the third day, the fifth day, many days passed, and she could not find a husband, a man worthy of her. One day, they turned a corner in the pathway, and they saw a village in the bend of a river. It was a very poor village. It was a religious village of monks and their followers. And she knew that she would not find a husband there. But out of respect, they stopped and she went into the temple to talk to the monk. And as she was speaking to him and thanking him for what he did for the kingdom, she saw enter the door a young man, a handsome young man, a beautiful young man who had eyes that were brighter than any eyes that she had ever seen. It was love at first sight for her. She whispered to the monk that she was talking to, "Who is that young man who's coming through the door?" He said, "It's a prince. And he is with his father, an old man who is blind. He was a king, but then he lost his kingdom. And now he's old, he's blind. And this young prince, Satyavan, has dedicated all of his time and all of his effort to taking care of his father. He has no life of his own." Well, the princess finished the conversation, rushed out to the procession, and they headed back to the palace as fast as they could. When she got to the palace, she rushed into the throne room and she said, "Father, I found the man. I know who will be my husband. I want you to arrange the marriage." But in the room with the king was the king's fortune teller. And he said, "Tell me the name of this man." And she said, "Prince Satyavan." And the fortune teller said, No, you can't marry that man. Because 1 year after his marriage, I can see the future. He's going to die. So don't marry that man. But the princess said, "He's a person that I love. I don't care if his life is short or long. I want to spend time with him. So Father, please arrange the marriage." And the father agreed. So again, you can imagine the great procession with servants and counselors and elephants heading from the palace out to that poor community. The king went to the young man and asked about marriage. Of course, he's going to marry the most beautiful woman in the entire kingdom and the wealthiest woman in the kingdom. So he quickly agreed to get married. But his father, the old blind king who had been disposed, said, "Wait a minute." And he talked to the king. He said, "Will your daughter be able to live in this poor community?" Because the tradition was that the bride goes to live with the husband. Will she be able to live here wearing simple cotton dresses rather than the silk that she wears? Unadorned, not with the jewels that she wears in the palace. And will she be able to cook for her husband with food that she raises with the toil and sweat of her own hands and her own effort? The king had not a chance to answer because the princess said, "Yes, I can do that. I don't care about wealth. I don't care about comfort. I want to live with the person that I love." So on that day, they were married. They held hands. Thrice, they walked around the sacred fire at the altar in front of all of the monks and all of the followers and in front of the two kings. They became husband and wife. It was a wonderful marriage for 360 days. But as they approached the anniversary of their marriage, Princess started to think about the fortune teller and about his prediction that her husband would die on the anniversary of their marriage. So the princess went into the temple in front of the altar of the sacred flame. She prayed that her life, the life of her husband, would be spared. For 3 days and 3 nights, she didn't eat, she didn't sleep. She prayed for the life of her husband. On the day of the anniversary, the prince came into the altar and said, "My dear, lovely wife, I haven't seen you for 3 days, but this is our anniversary. So I'm going to go hunting in the forest. I'm going to look for a beautiful deer or a boar that we can have at dinner on our anniversary night. So he turned and walked out of the temple. And she followed him. And he turned and he said, no, 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 no. You stay. 3 days and 3 nights you haven't eaten, you haven't slept. You need to rest. She persisted. She insisted that she go with him. So they went into the forest. Again, there they were, walking hand in hand in a beautiful forest. The fragrance of the blooming flowers on the trees made it seem like magic. They stopped by a brook in the mountains with clear water and enjoyed that. They listened to the sound of peacocks singing, beautiful music for them. And finally, in the heat of the day, they found a large, spreading tree. They sat under that tree to get out of the heat of the sun. And right away, the prince said, my head, it's such a fever, and my body is burning, my head is aching. And he started to breathe with shallow breaths. The princess didn't know what to do. She had his head on her lap. And she looked up in the distance in the forest. She saw movement. And all of a sudden, approaching her was a princely man whose skin was darker than the darkest night. His eyes were bright red and his robes were red, blood red. And she said, who are you? He said, I am Yama, the god of death. I have come to take the soul of your husband to the south, to my domain, to the land of the dead. What could she do? The god reached into his robes and pulled out a rope that had a noose on it, and he passed it over Satyavan's chest. And he pulled. And the likeness of Satyavan, but just the size of a hand, came out of his chest. And the god of death took that soul and put it into his robes. And then he turned and glided away into the forest. The princess ran after him. He could hear her footsteps and he said, stop. You can't follow me to the domain of death. But you have been so loyal and so dedicated that I will give you a wish. I will grant you any wish that you care to ask for, except I can't grant you the life of your dead husband. So the princess thought, and she said, my father-in-law, he's blind. He lost his kingdom. Please restore his sight, and please restore his kingdom. And the god of death, Yama, said, yes, it's done. And he turned and he glided away in the forest. But she persisted. She ran after him. And while he was gliding so smoothly and easily, the thorns were tearing at her legs, and the stones were cutting her feet, and she screamed in pain. He turned and looked at her again, and with a sterner voice said, you cannot follow me. The wheel has turned. You cannot undo the wheel. But I will grant you a second wish. Anything that you want except the life of your husband. She said, my father, can you bless my father with many more children? The god of death, Yama, said, yes, it's done. And he turned and glided away again. But she wasn't satisfied. She was still running after him with all of her energy, breathing hard, and he heard her again and he stopped. He turned, and this time really sternly he said, you cannot take another step towards my domain. Your husband will be happy. He led a virtuous life. He will be happy where I'm taking him, but you cannot go. But I will give you one last wish. what will you wish for? And she said, venerable God of death, benevolent God of death, I ask that I have many children, and that my children are the children of Satyavan. The God of death stepped back. His red eyes got even darker and wider. And finally he said, you have not asked for the life of your husband, but you ask for something that will require that I return him to you. And I will do that. So the princess rushed back to the tree, the big spreading tree where the dead body of her husband lay. She took his head, put it on her lap, and his chest moved and his eyes opened. And there started a barrage of questions. It's almost dark. Where has the day gone? Have I been sleeping all day long? And then he looked at his wife and he said, you're crying and laughing at the same time. Why is that? And all that she could say to him is, my husband, let's return to the palace and celebrate our anniversary. They did. The god, Yama, made good on all of his promises. The old king's eyesight was restored. His kingdom was restored. The princess's father had many, many more children. And the prince and the princess lived a long and happy life, bearing many children. So when it came time for them again to go, escorted by Yama to the land in the south, they did so without tears and without fear. That story is amazing. It talks so much about the culture of India at that time. It's also interesting because it talks about a woman who was very bold, who was even very aggressive in what she wanted and how she wanted it. When we think of Indian culture, we don't think as about women having that kind of a role, but they do. So the story teaches us something about the culture that maybe people outside the culture don't understand very well. As we think about Hillary Clinton running for president, if we look at India, having a woman president is not anything new. So there's something in the culture that perhaps outsiders don't understand that they should understand. And my point is that through telling stories, you can make points, you can have people understand culture in ways that they never had before. If you have children who've grown up in this country and don't understand fully Indian culture, what a wonderful way to have them understand culture through telling of stories. So think about it. Storytelling is a wonderful mechanism for teaching children and for teaching